Hello everybody, I am Tom and you are watching my breakdown for the available race choices for Baldur's Gate 3. So the release of BG3 is just around the corner, and when you begin playing, after an intro cinematic, you'll pretty much be thrust straight into character creation. Now BG3 is based off the Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, which, being a tabletop RPG, has some relatively in-depth character creation, so leading up to launch I've planned out some videos for the D&D uninitiated, who might want some help choosing what they want to play. After the game releases, I plan to do some kind of more in-depth guides and builds, but for now, and for pre-release, I'm going to go over the basics to kind of give people an idea of the flavour of their choices, and more specifically we'll go in after the full game releases. So to start off today, we'll be looking at your race choices in the character creator. One small point here before we begin, Larian has decided to make the race choice a little bit less mechanically dependent than regular D&D. Ordinarily, your race will give you a bump in your ability scores. Generally, with a few exceptions, you get a +1 into one stat and a +2 into another, and the stats being raised are determined by your race. This makes some races fit naturally better with other classes, but Larian has kind of done away with this, and they've made the ability score improvements a choice for every race, so essentially you can just put them wherever you wish. It's still a +1 and a +2, but you can put them in any attribute you want, regardless of your race. This increases your freedom of choice, making a Gnome Barbarian easy to build, for example, but I do feel like it takes away a bit of the kind of player identity too. But with all of that out of the way, let's get down to the breakdown. First, I'll run through all of these races alphabetically, and there will be timestamps below if you want to skip to a specific race. First up alphabetically also happens to be the most diverse race, the Dragonborn. They're one of the rarer, and in my opinion, the coolest looking races in Baldur's Gate 3, standing on average at about 6.5 feet tall and weighing well over 100 kilos. Yes, I'm mixing Imperial and metric systems, sue me. Dragonborn have a dragon-like visage covering them head to toe with colourful scales, and the particular colour of the scales is determined by their dragon lineage. This is what makes Dragonborn have the most sub-races out of all the choices in BG3. Your ancestry determines your sub-race. We have black, blue, copper, gold, green, red, brass, bronze, silver, or white. Your choice of lineage will determine your racial features. All Dragonborn get a resistance to an element and a breath weapon corresponding to their lineage. For example, a gold Dragonborn will have a cone of fire breath and be resistant to fire, whereas a blue Dragonborn will have a line of lightning breath and be resistant to lightning damage. After using your breath weapon, you can't use it again until you take a short rest, it is worth noting. But Dragonborn I foresee being a rather popular choice because of how exotic they are. They're kind of a very rare race and they're very interesting to look at. They're by far the coolest looking in my opinion. And thematically, they are admittedly very, very cool. It is worth noting, however, that unless Larian makes some changes from the base 5e edition of D&D, the breath weapon is a bit weak when compared to some other racial features. It's really nice for levels like 1 and 2, and it will scale up as you level. It gains an additional damage dice when you hit level 6 and then at level 11. But generally speaking, it's going to be more optimal to use your other abilities and or your other spells once you hit like level 3 or 4 onwards. The Draconic Resistance, however, is a really good racial ability, and it's going to be good throughout the entire game. Damage Resistance, particularly from a common source such as fire or poison, is almost always good as a perk to have. It essentially just halves the amount of damage you would take. If you were going to take 20 fire damage, you'll take 10. It's great. So, as I said, mechanically the Dragonborn are ever so slightly weaker on average, but flavorfully they are very, very strong in my opinion. But moving on, we now have the Drow. Denizens of the labyrinthine tunnels and caverns of the Underdark, these are technically speaking a sub-race of elves. However, they are societally and mechanically different enough that Larian chose to separate them as a completely different race in the actual options. Drow typically have skin pigmented in kind of blacks and greys. They occasionally get some blue or purple colours in there as well, but they also tend to have hair that is very light colours, usually grey or white. Both of these phenotypical features stem from the fact that they come from the Underdark, an expansive second world almost in the caves and caverns that completely underneath the surface of Faerun. Choosing a Drow gives you a Drow weapon fighting training, so you are proficient with rapiers, short swords, and hand crossbows. Also, being an elf, you have Fey ancestry, which means that your mind is somewhat protected from outside forces, you cannot be magically put to sleep, and you have advantage against being charmed. You also get some basic innate spellcasting as a Drow, being able to cast Dancing Lights at level 1, Fairy Fire at level 3, and the Darkness spell at level 5. Fairy Fire and Darkness are cast without requiring a spell slot, and you can only do them once per day, and you need to take a long rest before you can cast them again. And finally, being from the Underdark, you are keenly capable of seeing in the dark. Drow have superior dark vision, which allows them to see up to 80 feet in complete darkness, as if they were looking through dim light. But there are two sub-races to choose from the Drow in Baldur's Gate 3. However, mechanically, they're not any different really. It's all down to roleplay is how they were different, so people may react to you differently based off your sub-race, but it's not going to affect you mechanically. You can choose either the Lolthspawn Drow or the Seldarine Drow, both defined by their corresponding goddesses. Most Drow are Lolthspawn, Lolth being the evil spider goddess who is worshipped in horrendous ways in the Drow capital city of Menzoberranzan, which is located deep in the Underdark. Choosing to be a Lolthspawn obviously does not mean that you yourself are inherently evil, just that you were born into a culture that is evil, really. Some Lolthspawn choose to leave or are exiled because they're reviled by the acts of Lolth and her priestesses. Seldarine Drow, on the other hand, are Drow descended from those that rejected Lolth's misandrous theocracy. The name Seldarine is the formal name for the elven pantheon of gods, and one goddess in particular has a connection to these reformed Drow. Illustre, the Dark Maiden, is the only remaining good and kind god that has not completely forsaken the Drow. She is Lolth's daughter, and chose to continue caring for the Drow, and in doing so, she was exiled from the elven pantheon. She was kicked out of the pantheon and she's no longer allowed to serve. But she did it all out of love for, essentially, her people. So, choosing to play as a Drow can certainly add some cool role-playing moments to your game, as some NPCs might treat you with a modicum of suspicion due to the evil nature of Lolth and her cult. But in any case, next up we have the Dwarf. Short, stocky, and wide, dwarves are a staple fantasy race. They usually stand well under 5 feet tall, and yet often weigh even more than humans, who can easily stand 2 feet taller than them. They are much longer lived than humans, commonly living up to about 400 years old or even older. Choosing to be a dwarf in Baldur's Gate 3 gives you dwarven combat training, making you proficient with battle axes, hand axes, light hammers, and warhammers. You also have naturally good constitution, making you resistant to poison damage, and you are less likely to get the poison condition. Being a race well versed with working underground, you can see it in total darkness up to about 40 feet around you, even as if it was dimly lit. Additionally, due to your short stature, you can't actually run as fast as most of the taller races. Your movement speed is 25 feet per round rather than the average of 30. But there are 3 sub-races to choose from as a dwarf. You can be a hill dwarf, a mountain dwarf, or a Duergar, also known as the Grey Dwarf. Firstly, we have the Hill Dwarves. They're particularly hardy. In addition to all the generic dwarf features that I listed above, you also gain Dwarven Toughness, giving you 1 extra HP every time you level up, so all in all you'll have more HP generally speaking. Next we have Mountain Dwarves, which gain armor training, making them able to wear both light and medium armor, regardless of their class. So if you wanted to be a wizard that can wear armor, you can go as a dwarf and it just gives it to you straight out. It's also worth noting here that I suspect Mountain Dwarves will probably get some other kind of small bonus here, because in the D&D rule set as it stands in the books, Mountain Dwarves get an extra increase to their strength above the regular that most other classes get, and since Larian has kind of standardized the ability score increases over all the races, I assume Mountain Dwarves might get like a little extra bonus somewhere just to compensate for that extra loss that they got. But finally, we have the Grey Dwarves, or the Duergar. These dwarves are the dwarven equivalent to Drow, essentially. They live in the Underdark, they have been enslaved by mind flayers, although throughout multiple periods in their history, they've been enslaved by mind flayers, so they're kind of like not wholly enslaved by them. There's just groups that get enslaved every now and then. They're not currently in the early access. They are also not in the player's handbook specifically written out. So the bonuses they'll get, I don't know specifically, but I can make some educated guesses. I would say you could probably expect superior dark vision. Just like the Drow, they can probably see in 80 feet rather than the base of 40, as well as some limited spellcasting. Specifically lore-wise, Duergar can cast Enlarge on themselves, doubling their size and making their melee attacks do more damage. Additionally, they can turn invisible, so I'd expect to see either of these, or maybe both of these as options, once per day abilities, to turn invisible and increase your size, but we'll see. I don't know what they actually have specifically, we'll find out when the full game releases, I suppose. Moving on, we have the Elves. Moving from one fantasy staple to another, we have the Elves. Longest lived of all the races of Faerun, they commonly live to well over 700 years old, and tend to be a little shorter and slimmer than humans on average. They can have skin and hair similar to humans, but they also go beyond this with having copper or bronze skin even. and having natural blue or green shades in their hair. Choosing to play as an elf gives you the following features. For starters, you get dark vision, being able to see 40 feet in complete darkness as if you're in dim light. Your Fey ancestry also gives your mind some protection. You gain advantage on resisting charm effects, and you cannot be magically put to sleep. Additionally, you have elven weapon training, making you proficient with long swords, short swords, long bows, and short bows. And finally, elves have keen senses, giving them proficiency with the perception skill, meaning you'll notice things when you're kind of just walking around the world. The game will roll skill checks in the background, so if you're walking past something that is like a hidden door, for instance, it'll roll a passive kind of perception check in the background, and then you might see it because you have higher perception. There are two sub-races of the elf. Firstly, we have the magically inclined high elf, and then the nature-loving wood elf. High elves have a very natural affinity with magic. As such, when you choose this sub-race, you learn a wizard cantrip of your choice, regardless of what class you choose. To be a beginner friendly as possible, I'll explain what a cantrip is. A cantrip is essentially a level 0 spell that you can cast whenever you want, just at will. And next we have the wood elves, and they're most at home in the natural world. They're naturally quite sneaky. If you choose to play as a wood elf, you are proficient in the stealth skill, so you're hard to perceive when you're trying to conceal yourself. You're also light on your feet. You gain an additional 5 feet of movement per turn, so you can move 35 feet in a single round of combat, whereas most races can only move 30. Next up, we have Githyanki. By far the most alien race choice in Baldur's Gate 3, the Githyanki are a race of, well, aliens. They're from the astral plane. Githyanki are inherently linked with the story of Baldur's Gate 3 because they are bitter rivals of the Mind Flayers, seeking their destruction at pretty much whatever cost. The Gith were a race that were once enslaved totally and completely by the Mind Flayers. There wasn't a single free Gith in the entire place. And after their uprising, the Githyanki swore as a people, as an entire, essentially, civilization, that they were going to kill every last Mind Flayer in existence. And they've become pretty adept at it. They wield iconic silver swords, and they enter battle atop the backs of red dragons. A Githyanki warband is a sight to behold. If you choose to play a Githyanki, you gain specialized martial arts training, so you have proficiency with all swords, short swords, long swords, and great swords, as well as proficiency with light and medium armor. Additionally, your training gives you a skill proficiency of your choice, so any skill you like, you can choose to be proficient in it. And due to the centuries of enslavement by the psionic mind flayers, some of their power has been kind of passed on to the Gith, and you can move things with your mind, as well as boost your jumping capabilities with this kind of psionic power. In the game, this is represented by a special version of the Mage Hand cantrip. That's for your telekinesis. Yours is invisible, so people can't see you manipulating it. At level 1, when you choose this race, you get a special version of the jump spell at level 3 as well. And when you reach level 5, you've mastered your psionics enough that you can teleport a short distance with them. You gain the Misty Step spell, and you can cast it once per long rest without expending any resources whatsoever. The Githyanki have no separate sub-races for now, so we can move on to the Gnomes. Definitely the smallest race you can choose to play in Baldur's Gate 3, gnomes are usually around 3 to 4 feet tall and have relatively slight builds. They're usually quite skinny. They're excitable and inquisitive by nature. Gnomes love names, specifically their own. It isn't uncommon for a gnome to have 6 or 7 names, all of which tend to have unpronounceable groupings of consonants, and they have a habit of changing the names or adding new ones if the fancy strikes them. When in and around races that are more stuffy about names, they tend to stick to 3 that are the most fun to say, but between gnomes, anything goes. If you choose to play as a gnome in BG3, it means that, as with dwarves and halflings, your short stature makes you move slower in combat compared to other races. You have 25 feet of movement per turn as opposed to the average of 30. However, you also get gnomish cunning, which gives you advantage on intelligence, wisdom, and charisma saving throws. For those uninitiated with D&D, what this means functionally is that spells and abilities that try to affect your mind, such as charm or fear or even paralysis in some cases, are far less likely to have an effect on you. Finally, you also get dark vision, allowing you to see 40 meters in the dark as if you're in dim light. Gnomes have 3 separate subraces to choose from. You have the forest gnome, the rock gnome, or the deep gnome. Forest gnomes are at home in the wild. If you choose to be a forest gnome, you have spent so much time immersed in nature that you can talk with animals. You gain the Speak with Animals spell, which you can cast for free. If you instead pick the rock gnome, you'll have Artificer's Law, meaning you have expertise in history checks. Mechanically, this means that you add your proficiency bonus twice whenever you make a history check. And history checks are somewhat self-explanatory here, but you'll roll one whenever you're trying to recall knowledge about a place, time, or an event. We have the final subrace, which is the Deep Gnomes, also known as Sverfneblin. This is how you say this word, by the way. It is the name for their race in their own language. As I said, unpronounceable consonants put together. But Deep Gnomes reside in the Underdark. Unlike the Drow and the Duergar, however, Deep Gnomes are, as a general rule, just as good-natured and friendly as their cousins on the surface. Turns out not everyone that lives underground is a complete arsehole. Who knew? If you choose to play as a deep gnome, you'll get superior dark vision, which is double that of the other gnome variants. You get 80 V to vision in the dark rather than 40. Additionally, you will have advantage on all stealth checks, as in the Underdark, it's a pretty dangerous place. So Svirfneblins are pretty good at hiding because you need to survive. But moving on, we have the half-elf. Half-elves are, as the name implies, half-elf and half-human. Not truly belonging to either culture, elves tend to see half-elven as human, and humans tend to see half-elven as elves. As is the way of bias and prejudice, people tend to see the differences far quicker than they see the similarities. Choosing to be a half-elf gives Fey ancestry from your elven parent, making you hard to charm. You have advantage on your saving throws against getting charmed, and you also cannot be magically put to sleep. You also have dark vision up to 40 feet. I suspect that half-elves actually might get another little bonus here, just because, again, in the D&D base version, half-elves have a utility in that they can choose where they want to put their attribute points. However, Larian has added the feature for all races, so all races can choose where their attribute points go. Therefore, the kind of niche that half-elves had before isn't there, so they might get a little extra here, but that remains to be seen. Half-elves were pretty strong in the first place because of this choice. They may not need anything else, because it may not need that balancing level, but we will see. As for subraces, this comes down to your elven lineage. So you can be half high elf, you can be half wood elf, or you can be half drow. And they gain the corresponding benefits from the elven subclass. So high half elves choose a wizard cantrip, just as high elves do. Wood elves get proficiency in stealth and an additional 5 feet of movement, just like their wood elf cousins. And drow, half elves get drow magic, giving them dancing lights at level 1, fairy fire at level 3, and darkness at level 5. Moving on, we have the half-orc. As with the half-elves, half-orcs are somewhat self-explanatory on what they are. Their name implies the correct thing. They are half-human and half-orc. They tend to be much larger than humans, generally around 6 to 7 feet tall and built very muscularly, like their orc forebears. They often have skin that's kind of a grey or green colour to it, and their most notable feature is their fangs protruding from their lower jaw. They have huge, big incisors that come up from the bottom and go up past their lips. If you choose to play as a half-orc, you can gain the following traits. It's worth noting that this is educated guesswork from the D&D Player's Handbook, as the race is not available in the early access for Baldur's Gate 3, so I'm just kind of guesstimating based off what it is in 5th edition D&D. But you gain dark vision from your Orcish heritage. You can see 40 feet away in total darkness as if you're in dim light. You're also naturally menacing, making you proficient in the intimidation skill. On top of that, you have relentless endurance. When you are reduced to 0 HP, rather than falling unconscious, which is what normally would happen, just by the sheer force of your will, you instead fall to 1 HP. You can only do this once before needing to have a long rest, but it can keep you in the fight for at least one more round to do some more damage before you go down. Finally, as a half-orc, you are big, strong, and have savage attacks. When you hit a critical hit with your melee weapon, you can roll 1 additional damage dice and add that damage to the extra critical hit, allowing for huge amounts of damage when you score a crit. They do a lot of damage when they're up-close melee fighters. There are no subclasses for the orc, so we can move on now to the halfling. Halflings are what one might expect when they're thinking of Tolkien's halflings, or hobbits. They're a short race, around the same time as gnomes, although they're often a bit beefier than gnomes are. Gnomes tend to be a bit more skinny. They adore food and drink, and most of them enjoy the quiet life, relaxing and whiling the day away. If you choose to play as a halfling, as with the other short races that I've mentioned before, your movement speed is only 25 feet rather than the average of 30. However, you gain additional benefits that more than make up for it. For starters, all halflings are naturally very lucky. If you roll a 1 on an attack roll, an ability check, or a saving throw, you can re-roll the die, although you must use the new roll, even if that new roll is a 1. So if you roll a 1 and then you re-roll that and it lands on a 1 again, it's still a 1. You don't get to keep re-rolling that 1. That would be a little overpowered. But there are 2 sub-races of halflings, the stealthy Lightfoots and the sturdy Stronghearts. Lightfoots are naturally very good at remaining undetected. You are proficient with stealth, allowing you to remain hidden while you're sneaking around. And then the Stronghearts, they're said to have some kind of dwarven ancestry. A lot of people tend to believe they are. They're sturdier than their Lightfoot cousins, and as a Strongheart, you have advantage on saving throws against being poisoned, and additionally, you also have resistance to poison damage, so you only take half damage from it. Next up, we have the humans. Humans, I don't imagine, need too much of an introduction. I assume most of you watching this are human. They're the most populous race in Faerun, and although comparatively short-lived to the other races, they're probably the most adaptable and industrious of all the races in Faerun. As for what you get by choosing a human, this is in some way going to be changed by Larian, because as per the D&D rules, humans don't get any special traits, but instead they get a +1 into all of their attribute points, making them a very good race for multiclassing, generally speaking, because you can hit all those stat thresholds that you need. However, as I said, all the stat attributes are being changed by Larian, so they're going to have to do something to compensate for how humans are. I assume it's going to be a weapon or an armor proficiency. We'll have to actually wait and see. Okay, so I'm back. Turns out that people who have actually got access to the full game already, it's probably not the actual release build, but it's the full game build at the very least, have actually seen what these human bonuses are. So according to Fextralife, I'll link to his channel in the comments, humans gain the light armor proficiency with polearm weapons, so you get proficiency with spears, pikes, halberds, and glaives. You also get an increased carrying capacity, which, generally speaking, for those unaware, is determined by your strength score. So you can have a higher carrying capacity with a lower strength with humans. If this is indeed all the added features that they're getting, which it might be, it might not be, it depends. They could easily add more from the build that Fextralife was playing to the launch build. We'll see, I'm not sure. But it seems to me that humans are probably mechanically the weakest race, which is really unfortunate, because I feel like you often have to make them a bit stronger because they're kind of boring in my mind. But notably, Githyanki have pretty much the same bonuses as them, only they get psionic magic as opposed to carrying capacity, which just seems better. But I don't know, that remains to be seen. We'll find out one way or the other. In any case, we can move on to the final race, which is the Tieflings. With skin pigmented in strikingly vibrant reds, deep blues, and regal purples, horns protruding from their forehead and long devilish tails, Tieflings look the part for the denizens of the Hells. However, they are in actual fact humans in the most genetic sense. Somewhere in a Tiefling's bloodline there is a diabolical heritage, whether that be born from casting of dark magics and the makings of deals with devils, or simply having an ancestor that was just a devil. This infernal heritage is what causes their unique appearance, and it is their unique appearance that has them in many places ostracized and outcast. If you choose to play as a Tiefling, you gain the following benefits. Firstly, you have dark vision to a distance of 40 feet, and you gain hellish resistance, making you resistant to fire. You'll only take half damage from all sources of fire. You can also learn a cantrip at level 1, and a second level spell that you can cast once a day, both at level 3 and level 5. The nature of the spells that you learn depends on the subclass that you choose, which are defined by the particular devil from which your infernal bloodline stems. Firstly, we have the Asmodeus Tiefling. If your bloodline is infested with the Lord of the Nine Hells, you gain the Thaumaturgy cantrip at level 1, Hellish Rebuke at level 3, and at level 5 you get the Darkness spell. If instead your bloodline is from the Archdevil of Contradictions, Lord Mephistopheles, then you gain the Mage Hand cantrip, and at level 3 you get Burning Hand spell, and finally at level 5 you get the spell Flame Blade. And finally is the bloodline of Zariel, the Fallen Angel, Lord of Avernus, the first layer of the Nine Hells. You gain the Thaumaturgy as a cantrip, and followed by that at level 3 you get Searing Smite, and finally, at level 5, you gain Branding Smite. And with that, we're done with all the races you can choose from in Baldur's Gate 3. Going forward before release, I'll be doing some guides on all of the classes available to choose from, as well as perhaps an overview of the basic rules, so those who haven't played either D&D or the Early Access can get kind of a basic grasp of what they need to do before they start. But in any case, for those who made it to the end of the video, leave a like if you found yourself enjoying the video, please. Subscribe if you're not yet subscribed. And as always, thanks for watching, and I shall see you next time. Bye, guys.